Good Wednesday morning, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to the Southern Oregon Weather Midweek Update. I want to start by giving you a recap of the overall pattern that we saw for the first 3 months of the year, January, February, and March, and how that compares to the pattern we've been seeing so far in April. We'll also talk about our weekend forecast. Will this nice weather continue through the weekend? And then we'll get into some mid-range teleconnections. So first, our NOAA satellite imagery here shows some high clouds over the area. Most of the clouds are moving into the Rockies. There's a storm that's going to drop a significant amount of snow, maybe 1 to 2 feet in some areas, but we're not going to see any precipitation from that storm. It's too far to the north and east. The reason for that is that we still have this big ridge of high pressure dominating our area, with most of the storm track heading east of us. We do have a little piece of energy here that has managed to sneak underneath the ridge. That's going to cause some showers to pop up, mainly over the Sierra over the next few days, but not really expecting any shower activity over the Southern Oregon Cascades and Siskiyous, and certainly not over the valleys for the rest of the week. So how does this pattern compare with the pattern that we saw predominantly for the first 3 months of the year? Well, here you can see we also saw a big ridge of high pressure in the Pacific during the winter, but it was situated farther west, north of Hawaii, and that allowed us to come under the influence of this trough. Again, most of the energy went into the Rockies, which saw above average snowfall, and you can see this ridge nosed east into California a little bit. So that sent most of the storm energy north of us. However, we did see occasional big storms at the end of March. We saw some big storms. Middle of January was also a stormy period. And if you recall, the end of November was also quite stormy. We saw that big bomb cyclone. What's interesting is that sometimes the weather pattern in November can pop up again as we head into spring. So I thought it was interesting that we saw a big storm at the end of November, the bomb cyclone, and then we also saw another big storm or two at the end of March. So just something to keep in mind, that sometimes winter can have bookends like that. So that pattern that we saw for the first 3 months of the year resulted in quite a bit of dryness over California. You saw that ridge that pushed most of the storminess to the north. Here, Washington and the Rockies were generally above average for precipitation. And you can see also the southern tier of the United States was pretty wet. Not quite along the Gulf Coast, but this wetness was a result of that split flow pattern that we saw with the polar jet shifted northward, and then the subtropical jet cutting underneath. And areas of extreme southwest Oregon and especially California were kind of left high and dry in the middle. However, it wasn't a particularly warm winter either. In fact, on balance, it was even a little bit below average for areas of southwest Oregon. So how does that compare with the pattern we've been seeing for the first 2 weeks of April? Well, you can see a flip in the precipitation patterns. That ridge of high pressure has moved farther to the coast, into the Gulf of Alaska, and that's been blocking a lot of rain from reaching Washington. But we see some storm energy cutting underneath and leading to some quite wet conditions over central and southern California into Nevada, and even north into the Shasta area and the Marble Mountains. And there's a concern that this combination of a very dry winter followed by a pretty wet spring could lead to a more active fire season. We've seen this type of scenario in the past, especially 2017-18, where we had a drier than average winter and then a wet spring, and that often results in a more active fire season. Not always, but what can happen is that the dry winter causes large fuels, mature forests, to lose moisture, so those are very dry, and then the wet spring fuels the growth of ladder fuels, so grasses and brush. And once those ladder fuels dry out in June and July, they're easy tinder for lightning strike fire or human-caused fire. And so this combination of a dry winter and a wet spring could lead to a more active fire season. We'll have to see how wet the rest of April ends up, but that's something to keep in mind. Here are temperatures for the month so far. We're starting to get a little bit above average because of those warm days we've been seeing over the past week. And we'll certainly see some more above average days this week. Here's the Weather Channel forecast calling for significantly above average temperatures on Thursday and Friday. Once again, that's about 10 to 13 degrees above average for Medford for this time of year. And then you can see the Weather Channel starts to introduce some chances of precipitation on Sunday. And that's because you can see this piece of energy cutting underneath. The ridge weakens a little bit and moves northward, allowing some storms to cut underneath and possibly move into the west coast. So our teleconnections agree pretty strongly that this pattern is going to happen with the ridge shifting northward. Here's the atmospheric angular momentum. It's positive right now, leading to this kind of a pattern with the ridge blocking storms from reaching Oregon and most of the storms going into the central U.S. But that AAM is forecast to fall over the next week to 10 days. And that argues for a weakening of this ridge, allowing more storms to reach us. Also, when we look at our MJO, it's supposed to move into phases 2 and 3. And here you can see the ridge, again, weakens, moves northward, allowing more storm energy to cut underneath and move into the west coast. So interesting that we have two different signals, the MJO and the AAM, agreeing that this could happen. And also when we look at our deterministic models, like the Canadian, the computer models, we see showers returning over southern Oregon next week. So here's a loop of the Canadian starting on Sunday and going through next week. So you can see it has a chance of showers almost every day of the week. I don't think it's going to rain steadily every day of the week. These could be hit and miss showers, scattered showers, but the point is the computer models agree that this pattern change could take place. Finally, I want to share with you another resource from St. Louis University. This is a resource that blends climatology, so what happens on average over the United States during this time of year, what's the average amount of precipitation, what's the average temperature. So it blends climatology with analogs. And once again, analogs are those years that were similar to the year that we're observing now. And you can see for days 6 through 8, so the middle of next week, years that were similar to this one had below average temperatures over southern Oregon for that period, for the end of April. Most of those years also had above average precipitation over our area for the end of April. So it's a good indication that if those other years were very similar to this one, and they had a cool and wet end to April, that we could have a cool and wet end to April this year as well. So interesting to take note of that. And there are indications that this trend could continue later into next week during the 9 to 11 day time frame as well. So to recap, when we looked at our trends that we saw over the course of the winter, it was drier than normal, significantly drier than normal over California, but not appreciably warmer than average. By contrast, so far in the spring, we have seen some wetter times, some above average precipitation, and this could lead to a possibly more active fire season over southern Oregon, especially if we see a wet next couple of weeks. Once again, the moisture could fuel the growth of brush and grasses, those latter fuels. And then once those dry out, that leads to plenty of fuel being available for wildfires over the summer. Meanwhile, those mature forests, those big trees, are drier than normal because of the dry winter. So it's a combination that can lead to some more active fire activity over the summer. So we'll have to keep an eye on that. It does look like we'll be warm and dry until the weekend. However, showers could return next week. I'm fairly confident of this because almost all of our analog signals and the deterministic models like the Canadian agree that this could happen. And we have those analogs suggesting that we could see a cooler and wetter end to April. So guys, thanks so much for tuning in. Don't forget to set your notifications for that weekend update. As we move into the summer, I might post the midweek update less frequently, but you will continue to receive those weekend updates, and I'll probably start incorporating some smoke forecasts if we do see some wildfire activity over the summer as well. So please leave a comment and subscribe if you enjoyed the forecast.